April 1945. A German factory complex near Buchenwald, Germany. The concrete walls of the manufacturing facility sit silent under a gray spring sky. But the silence is an illusion. Along the outer chain-link fence, 200 emaciated figures hang from wire bonds, their hollow cheeks and striped uniforms swaying slightly in the cold wind. The retreating SS rearguard has positioned machine guns inside the building, calculating that the advancing Americans will never open fire through a living wall of starved prisoners. It is a final, desperate gamble designed to freeze the Allied advance, using the ultimate shield of human misery. But the German commander has miscalculated the nature of the man leading the oncoming tanks. General George S. Patton will not negotiate with the architecture of mass murder, and his response will turn the factory into a tomb. This is the story of what happened when an SS officer used 200 concentration camp survivors as a human barrier, and the American general who refused to be blackmailed. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show how some weapons require a soldier to break first. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Reinhardt was 38 years old, a career officer from Boston, Massachusetts, serving with the Third Army. His grandfather had fled the pogroms of Romania in 1885, seeking a life where a man was judged by his labor, rather than his bloodline. Reinhardt had spent the last 3 weeks racing through the collapsing territory of the Third Reich, pushing his armored battalion through smoke and ruin to reach the camps before the executioners could finish their work. 2 days earlier, he had stood at the gates of Buchenwald, watching men who weighed less than 80 pounds weep as they tried to salute the American flag. He had not slept since that morning, his eyes burning with the dust of the road and the memory of the ash he had seen. Now, looking through his field glasses at the factory fence, he recognized the specific horror he had promised himself he would destroy. Sturmbannführer Klaus Heydrich was 41 years old, an SS rearguard commander from Vienna, Austria. He wore a tailored wool tunic, his leather boots polished to a mirror shine despite the mud of the retreat, and an iron cross pinned precisely to his left breast pocket. For 2 years, he had commanded a subcamp near Buchenwald, overseeing the systematic destruction of 1,200 prisoners through forced labor and deliberate selection for the gas chambers. He considered the inmates beneath the status of human beings, referring to them in his official reports as raw material to be used until spent. With the American tanks visual from his observation post, Heydrich stood behind the reinforced concrete of the factory office, confident that his living barrier would force the Americans into a prolonged diplomatic delay. He believed his understanding of Western morality was a weapon that would guarantee his survival. By April 1945, the European theater had dissolved into a frantic, chaotic race toward the heart of Germany. The Third Reich was collapsing under its own weight, its armies broken into isolated pocket commands, rear guards, and fanatical remnants trying to buy time for leaders who had already abandoned them. The Allied advance was so rapid that traditional front lines no longer existed. Regiments found themselves bypassing entire cities, leaving small, heavily armed units of German troops trapped behind the advancing columns. In this environment of total collapse, the usual rules of engagement began to warp under the pressure of desperation. Smaller German units, particularly those belonging to the SS, knew exactly what awaited them if they were captured by troops who had just witnessed the liberation of the concentration camps. They knew the lists of war criminals were long, and they knew their names were on them. Across the region, other Allied officers had occasionally paused their advance when faced with civilian hostages or complex urban blockades, choosing to negotiate or wait for infantry support rather than risk heavy casualties or public atrocities. This hesitation had created a dangerous precedent in the minds of commanders like Heydrich, who viewed American caution not as humanity, but as a tactical vulnerability to be exploited. The factory complex outside Buchenwald was the perfect anvil for this strategy. It was a reinforced position, stocked with ammunition, and capable of holding out for days if the Americans could be kept from using their superior firepower. The morning mist was beginning to lift from the fields, revealing the true scale of the barrier the SS had constructed. The engine noise from Reinhardt's idling half-tracks rose into the cold air as the battalion waited for orders. A white flag moved slowly across the open field between the American lines and the factory gate. Captain Thomas Miller, a 26-year-old company commander from Cleveland, Ohio, walked behind the banner with his hands clear of his holster. He stopped 50 meters from the first line of tied prisoners, his eyes scanning the skeletal figures whose heads hung toward the frozen mud. An SS lieutenant stepped out from the main administrative door, his hand resting on the grip of a sidearm. He did not look at the prisoners. He looked only at the American captain. "We have 200 workers attached to our defensive perimeter," the lieutenant said, speaking through an interpreter. "Any projectile fired at this structure will pass through them before it strikes our brickwork. Remove those men from the wire immediately." Miller said, "They are non-combatants under the protections of international law. Your unit will stack its arms in the courtyard and surrender to the authority of the Third Army." The lieutenant laughed, a short, dry sound that barely carried over the idling engines of the distant half-tracks. "You do not dictate terms to us. Captain, these individuals are state property, and they are currently serving as our protective barrier. If you wish to destroy this factory, you must murder the very people you claim you came to liberate." "This is an atrocity," Miller said, his voice tightening. "Your names are already recorded. If one prisoner dies on that fence, every officer in this facility will hang." "Then we will hang together," the lieutenant replied. "But your newspapers will print the photographs of American shells tearing these unfortunates apart. Sturmbannführer Heydrich has already prepared a radio broadcast for the international press. The world will know that the Third Army uses slaughter to achieve its victories." Miller looked past the officer to the windows of the factory. He could see the dark barrels of heavy machine guns trained on his position. He saw the chest of a prisoner on the wire stop moving. "This is beyond my authority," Miller said. "We know," the lieutenant answered. "Go tell your superiors that the price of this facility is 200 lives." Miller turned and walked back toward the American lines without looking behind him. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His jeep pulled up to the battalion command post, its metal tires crunching over the loose gravel. The general wore his winter coat, the 4 stars on his helmet catching the thin light, and his ivory-handled revolvers rested against his hips. He did not look at the officers who stepped forward to salute. He walked straight to the artillery telescope, bent his tall frame, and focused the lens on the gray factory walls. For 2 minutes, the only sound was the wind. He stood up, his face completely pale, his lips compressed into a thin line. He looked at Reinhardt. "Who commands that garrison, Colonel?" "Sturmbannführer Klaus Heydrich, sir," Reinhardt replied. "He is wanted for mass executions at Buchenwald." Patton nodded once. "Bring a white flag. We will speak with this Austrian." The small party walked across the mud, stopping 100 meters from the perimeter fence. The stench of the dying prisoners was heavy in the air. Heydrich walked out from the factory doors, flanked by 2 guards, stopping 20 meters from Patton. He maintained a slight, superior smile. "Sturmbannführer Heydrich," Patton said, his voice quiet but perfectly distinct. "I am General Patton. You will release the 200 men on that wire within 10 minutes. They will walk toward my lines through a corridor my troops will provide. Your men will assist any prisoner who falls." "And if I refuse, General?" Heydrich asked. "Your artillery will make you their executioner." Patton did not blink. "You have 10 minutes to comply. If you do not, I will assume you intend to murder them yourself. In that case, this factory will cease to exist within 30 minutes. The dead will be on your hands." Heydrich's smile vanished. He realized the general was not negotiating. He turned without speaking and walked back into the facility. The minutes clicked away on Patton's pocket watch as the American soldiers stood frozen in their trenches. At the 9th minute, 3 prisoners near the eastern corner of the fence managed to tear their raw wrists from the wire bindings and tumbled into the mud. They began to crawl frantically toward the American lines. From the high concrete wall of the factory, an SS rifleman leaned out and fired twice, the dirt kicking up near the targets. Instantly, an American infantry sharpshooter squeezed his trigger, and the German soldier dropped from the wall into the courtyard below. The 3 survivors reached the safety of the ditch as the 10-minute mark arrived. Patton closed his watch with a sharp metallic snap. He turned to Reinhardt and ordered the corridor opened, giving the engineers 30 minutes to cut away as many men as possible under the protection of concentrated machine gun fire. American squads rushed forward with heavy wire cutters. working frantically while heavy-caliber rounds chewed the brickwork above their heads to suppress the German loopholes. They dragged 140 emaciated men from the fence, carrying them back like hollow sacks of bone. 60 prisoners were shot by internal SS fire or died of heart failure during the chaotic extraction. At exactly 30 minutes, the rescue team scrambled back, and the American artillery batteries opened a terrifying, continuous bombardment that leveled the factory into a smoking pile of red dust and shattered concrete. Walter Reinhardt remained in the army until the conclusion of hostilities, his chest heavy with the medals he had earned, but his mind anchored to the field outside Buchenwald. He returned to his home in Boston, Massachusetts, where he entered the legal profession as a prosecutor. For 35 years, he dedicated his private practice to hunting down and building legal cases against hidden members of the SS who had escaped the Nuremberg trials. He investigated 47 separate targets over his long career, successfully securing convictions for 31 of them before his death in 1995. He kept a small piece of the rusted factory fence on his desk until his final day. Klaus Heydrich never left the rubble of his final command post. His blackened, scarred remains were pulled from the crushed basement of the factory 3 days after the artillery assault ceased. American intelligence officers identified him through his charred SS dog tags and the unique serial number stamped into his sidearm. He was buried without ceremony or a headstone in an anonymous grave located in a nearby field, his name recorded only on the list of casualties who had brought about their own destruction. Patton never mentioned the encounter during his subsequent press briefings, nor did he include the details in his official reports to Supreme Headquarters. He made a single entry in his personal diary that evening, noting that he had refused to allow a criminal to dictate the terms of an American advance. He wrote that 60 men had been lost to the enemy's malice, but 140 had been pulled into the light of life, concluding that the arithmetic of war was brutal, but hesitation would have resulted in the slaughter of them all. Some historians have argued that Patton's refusal to negotiate put the lives of the helpless prisoners at immediate risk and forced a brutal choice that cost 60 men their lives on the wire. They contend that a more patient commander might have delayed the assault, using tactical encirclement or psychological warfare to convince the garrison to surrender without further bloodshed. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that any hesitation would have validated Heydrich's cruel methodology and encouraged other isolated German units to use identical tactics across the remaining pockets of resistance. What is certain is that the destruction of the factory terminated the career of a prolific war criminal and left 140 survivors alive to see the end of the conflict. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have paused the tanks to negotiate for those lives? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about how some weapons require a soldier to break first, make sure to subscribe.